Never, ever judge a book by its movie. So a few nights ago, I decided to take an evening off, watch a film, and just relax. And I had been meaning to reread Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I haven't read it in a few years. On my Amazon account, I saw The Green Knight. So I thought, what can be the harm? When will I learn? So today isn't going to be a movie review. I'm just going to rant a little bit about some of the reasons why books are so rarely translated into films in a good way. I'm going to talk about a couple exceptions, but I'm just going to go through what I see as the points, and I'm going to offer what I see as some of the solutions. So if you are someone that likes literature or that would like to like literature and you've been frustrated by adaptations into movies and TV shows, you may enjoy today. If you are one of those people that doesn't care at all about literature and you just want to be entertained, you've probably already moved on to something else. So we can probably split this into two really broad categories, and we could break it down into subcategories, but for today, that's not necessary. In the one hand, we have people who, like myself, like literature, we like books, and we would really like to see those stories translated faithfully into some kind of screen adaptation. On the other hand, we have people that don't care about the source material at all, and they just want to be entertained. And that is admittedly probably the larger part of the population. I also think we have a possible third category of people who want to complain about something while they scroll through social media. Now, very briefly, why are people like me annoyed by when someone in Hollywood takes some classic piece of literature and turns it into an adaptation and doesn't do what we think they should do? What does that mean? The first thing is just the simple anticipation of the story. I would love to see a faithful film of something like The Green Knight. I like period pieces. And in the case of The Green Knight, for me, the point where the film lost me, so here's a spoiler if you haven't seen it. So if you're really looking forward to seeing that, just stop this, save it, and come back to it later. The point where the film lost me was when Gawain got ambushed by the medieval equivalent of homeless people and got robbed. If I want to watch a period piece, I want to watch a story about a knight overcoming evil, not being a pansy. Another thing that can make all this frustrating is in a lot of cases we end up with a misrepresentation of the source material. So, quick story. I'm off the Green Knight and I'm going to talk about the 2004 film Troy, which I've picked on before and will pick on again. I'm picking on it today. Years ago, I had adopted an Australian Shepherd and I named him Odysseus. I won't go into why now because I want to keep this short, but it made sense for the dog. A few months later, I adopted a second dog and I named him Diomedes. Now, if you've read the Iliad, the connection makes sense. If you haven't read the Iliad, you might think that I said diabetes when I said Diomedes. One day I was at a coffee shop and sitting outside with the dogs, and a woman walked by. She asked about the dogs. People always asked about the dogs, and they asked the names. And if you are an eccentric individual, you end up explaining why you name your dogs what you do a lot. And I mean, my current dog is named Brasidas. She asked about the names. I went into a little bit of detail, not too much, hopefully. And as she was walking away, she made the comment that I should have named one of the dogs Hector, because as she said, Hector was very noble. I didn't get into her with it, but I'm pretty certain when she said that she's thinking about Hector as he was portrayed by Eric Bana in the 2004 film Troy, not by Hector as he is portrayed in the Iliad. Here's the difference. In the 2004 film Troy, that's portrayed as Hector and Paris grew up together. They have a close but complicated relationship. Hector's a responsible one, Paris is less so. Hector supports his little brother, who is apparently trying to rescue a young girl from her probably abusive and cheating husband. If we look at the tradition of the Iliad and the stories that surround it, Hector and Paris did not grow up together. They did not meet until they were adults. Hector grew up in Troy. Paris grew up in the hills. He wasn't even part of the royal family until it's a long story, but they met as adults. He wasn't raised by Priam and his mother, whose name I forget. I know it starts with an H. And in the Iliad, Well, in the events that led up to the Iliad, you don't see this in the Iliad, but Paris didn't rescue Helen from Menelaus. He seduced her, and she abandoned her family. She abandoned her husband. She abandoned her child. She abandoned her people because she was actually she was the queen of Sparta. She was the actual heir to the throne. Menelaus married into the family. He wasn't the king by birth. Paris was basically a pirate. He seduced the woman and he stole Menelaus's wealth. And when Odysseus and Menelaus went to Troy and petitioned for Helen's release and the release of Menelaus's wealth, the Trojans refused. So in the tradition of the Iliad, we basically have adultery and piracy. And I do think Hector was noble in that story and in other stories, but he was but it's not the same kind of nobility that we see in the film Troy. There's some really important differences between protecting your little brother, supporting him when he makes mistakes, and supporting piracy and adultery. The third thing is tone. This is the one that really sets me off. I get the people who are creative, and I get people wanting to put their own spin on things. We're gonna wrap with that. A good example of my complaint with tone would be the Chronicles of Narnia. So if you ever read the books, and if you haven't read the books, you really should. They're really good. Even though they're children's stories, if you're an adult, those are excellent books. If you ever start them, you need to read it all the way through because the end will surprise you. Don't just read the first one. But in the films, the first film sticks really good, really well. They did a very good job of sticking to the tone of the story and the basic story plot line. They actually fleshed it out a little bit to make it kind of fit a movie better. So one of the advantages to working with short stories, you have some freedom to flesh them out a little bit. Whereas when you're taking something like the Iliad or a novel, sometimes you have to parse it down so much that you probably don't do it justice. So the first movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I think they did a really good job. I still enjoy that film. It also has an excellent soundtrack. But when they made the second movie, they really diverted from the tone of the books. In that film, the storytellers had an opportunity to give the viewer, in the character of Peter, a good example of a noble, mature, responsible leader who cared more about his people and the cause than his own ego. And what we got instead was just a stereotypical teenager. And then in the third film, I feel like they continue to get away from the tone of the book, and they also got pretty far from the points of the story. I know some people that think they stuck to the story pretty close, but if you read the book and watch the film, they did not do a good job on the third one at all. Now, on the subject of creativity and originality, in the first place, I think there's a little too much pressure on people, or people put too much pressure on themselves to create original stories. Occasionally, something original comes along, and that can be a lot of fun. I think people need to focus more on just trying to tell stories really well. To some extent, I feel like if storytellers would focus on telling stories really well, they would discover some originality as they work through the process. When they're focused on trying to be original, at least in my opinion, sometimes the end result is just not entertaining. Now, if we take Shakespeare as an example, I think he's a good example for part of what I'm trying to say because he gets criticized sometimes for not telling original stories. Even when I was a kid, when I first got exposed to Shakespeare, I thought that was a silly argument. On the one hand, what Shakespeare was really, really good at is I feel like Shakespeare had very accurate insights into the human condition. He told stories extremely well. Shakespeare was a good storyteller. That doesn't mean that everything that he wrote was perfect. I don't like all his plays, but in the balance, I like most of them, and I think he was a very good storyteller. And he did amazing things with language. So I don't care if he got the idea from Italy or wherever, or if it wasn't an original idea. He took a story, he made it his own, and a lot of those stories are still entertaining people. Now, the last thing, this is pretty obvious, but a lot of original stories just do not transfer very well to a 2 or 3 hour time slot. They just don't. I could say this about the Harry Potter films. I really like the Harry Potter books. Incidentally, Jim Dale is an amazing narrator. I've listened to the audiobooks. I haven't read the text, but I've listened through the audiobooks at least twice. I wanted to listen to a book and then watch one of the films, and I couldn't get through the films. I just found them I didn't enjoy them. I like the first one. I'm okay with the second one. I kind of slogged through the third one, and the fourth one I shut off. And when I went and looked at the reviews, it relates to what I said earlier. I saw people like myself that liked the books and wanted an accurate telling of the books. And I saw other people that didn't care about the books. And sometimes they liked the film, sometimes they didn't like the film. I think that now, the way entertainment works today, an easy solution to this is some stories need to be series, not movies. So if you take something like Harry Potter, if they made a series that lasted 7 seasons and just dedicated each season to a book, I think they could put out a really good, faithful adaptation of that. It could be a lot of fun to watch. They wouldn't have Alan Rickman, and that would be tragic, but other than that, I think that could be done really well. And you could say that about anything else that I'm talking about. The Iliad would be really good as a miniseries if it was done right. All right, simple solutions to this problem that I have that if you're still here, you probably care about, or at least you're interested. Okay, the first thing is if someone's going to make an adaptation of a classic story, they need to stick to the tone of the original. If they don't understand the tone, make something else. Number two, don't hire script writers that either are not familiar with it, and especially script writers that don't like the source material. I can't confirm this, but I've heard several times that the people working on the scripts for the Witcher series don't like the source material. Why did they get hired? I don't understand that. There are things I liked about the first couple seasons. I stopped watching the third season, and I'm not planning on finishing it. And I didn't get through the third season, so I don't even know how it finished, but I got a couple episodes in and I'm done. And if you get hired to write a screenplay and you haven't read the source material, I can understand accepting the job. If someone approached me with a job and offered a screenplay job, and I explained I haven't read this, but I'm willing to, I would dig into that text and make sure it was a good fit, especially if it was something that had a lot of fans. But with something that has a lot of scope, like Harry Potter, if you just read one book, you're not going to get it. You really need to do more than that to, I think, get an idea of the breadth of what you're working with. The last thing, if someone's inspired by a classic story and it gives them an idea for a story they want to tell that deviates significantly in tone or whatever from the original, all they need to do is change the name of the story. I would not be offended by the film The Green Knight if it was not called The Green Knight. I wouldn't have enjoyed it, but it wouldn't have offended me. So if it had been named Dystopian Wanderings of a Victim through Medieval England, I just, okay, fine. But it was called The Green Knight. I could say this about a lot of other films. One really good example of a film that did this, where they got inspired to tell a story and they made it their own, is Oh Brother Where Art Thou, the 2000 film by the Coen brothers. I would guess that a lot of people watched that movie and have no idea that it was based off the Odyssey. But for those of us that like the Odyssey, we probably picked up on some of the things that are, like the Cyclops and some other things that are in there that if you're familiar with that story, they're right there for you to enjoy. So I felt like that was a really clever adaptation. It's in a different period. It's a very different situation, but it's a good homage to a classic story. And I can see someone may not like the movie for whatever reason, but it's not going to trigger people like me that just like literature. I found that to be a great adaptation of a story that I love. All right, this is more words than I like to use for a video. If you stuck with this, thank you very much. And I would be curious as to if there's a film adaptation of a classic story that you like, post it in the description. If there's one that you hate, let's talk about it. Go read a book.